It's a privilege to be here to share some thoughts with you on my journey, which has brought me here today, as well as some of these fascinating times that we are currently living through. To begin with, my career has been a compilation of stories not like Rachel's or Greg's or any that you've heard. First, I just ask that before you sit in judgment of them or whatever else I'm about to share with you, and then by which you'll be able to determine, to Karen's point, if I am an enlightened man or not, that you please consider the wisdom of a favorite adage of mine, which is that before you judge somebody, you walk a mile in their shoes, preferably mine, and then, if you don't like them, you're a mile away and you have their shoes. I started my business in the early 80s. I was 11 at the time, with a little bit of money and not a lot of time. I knew that most startup businesses fail in their first year because they run out of money before they've allowed time for cash flow. So I knew I needed to get started quickly, but first I needed a name because I needed to create business cards, stationery, register for a local trade show, and I also couldn't take the chance of registering a made-up name and then find out months later that it wasn't valid. And there wasn't a Google at the time, Jonathan. So I decided to use the name that my parents had given me some 20 years prior, as I knew one could usually get their own name registered. I then ran to Italy knowing I had a better chance of getting credit from an Italian shoe factory that needed business than from an American bank that didn't. I came back with a collection of ladies' shoes and needed to make plans to sell them. One had two options at that time. You could take a room at the Hilton Hotel and be one of 1,100 companies, 30 some odd companies per floor, 30 or so floors, not very distinctive. Or you can get a room, you could have a showroom, a fancy showroom within a 2-block radius of the Hilton Hotel, 6th Avenue, 56th Street. Clearly I not had the money or the time for either. So on a whim, a friend of mine had suggested that he would provide me with a trailer, a 40-foot trailer, and I could park it or I had asked, park it on the corner of 6th Avenue and 56th Street, everybody was, and they said, well, you can't do that. In New York, you can't park a bicycle for 10 minutes, let alone a truck for 3 days. And so I called the mayor's office and I said, excuse me, Mr. Mayor, this was Mayor Koch at the time. I said, how does one get permission to park a 40-foot trailer on the corner of 6th Avenue and 56th Street 2 weeks from today? And they said, sorry, son, they don't. This is New York. We give permission only under two circumstances: if you are a utility company servicing our streets, AT&T or Con Ed, or if you are a production company shooting a full-length motion picture, because we were going through an I Love New York campaign in the early 80s, and I think we still are today. And so I said, thank you, Mr. Mayor, hung up the phone, went to a stationery store that afternoon, for $14, changed my letterhead from Kenneth Cole Inc. to Kenneth Cole Productions Inc., filed for a permit the following morning with the mayor's office for permission to shoot a full-length motion picture called The Birth of a Shoe Company. I opened for business on December 2nd, and I had 2 New York policemen as my doorman, compliments to Mayor Koch, and I had a director. Sometimes it was filming his camera, sometimes it wasn't, and I had Klieg lights and I had stanchions, and I saw every important buyer in 2.5 days. The more important they were, the longer I made them wait. And we sold over 40,000 pair of shoes before the show was over. And I tell that story because it reminds us of the importance of resourcefulness, and that the best solution is rarely the most expensive and almost always the most creative. To this day, the company is still Kenneth Cole Productions, and until recently, it traded on the New York Stock Exchange under the symbol KCP. In wanting to grow the business, I had confronted a dilemma at the time because I was selling very cool shoes to very cool women. But the problem is there's only so many cool women. And if you want to sell more shoes, you stand the risk of selling people that are less cool, and then you stand the risk of that impacting the viability of the brand. So instead, I decided to create more products to sell to the same few customers and distribute in the same distribution points at that time. The business grew quickly, consuming all of my time and energy, and the demands and sacrifices were infinite. However, I used to often struggle with its significance. I used to remind my associates frequently that although what we were doing was important to us, no one actually needed what we sold. And they still don't, which is very humbling. In fact, if every shoe store in America closed its doors this afternoon at 12 o'clock, hardly an American would likely go barefoot for 16 years. Women don't need black shoes. Men don't need another pair of sneakers, white shirt, or a functionalist tie. But our job was to make them think they did, glad they thought it, and think it again. However, my personal struggle was, how do I make it relevant and meaningful? I eventually realized that if I could attach it to something that truly was important in and of itself, then conceivably it would become important for myself, my associates, and for our customers. In 1985, there was, as I discussed in that film, there was a pervasive consciousness in this country, including such initiatives as Hands Across America, We Are the World, Live Aid, Farm Aid, that addressed pervasive hunger in Africa. Not unimportant, but clearly not personally relevant to the individuals and to our customers. However, there was a looming dark cloud at home that no one was speaking about, and it was a virus that became known as AIDS. AIDS was a frightening new virus that was killing mostly young men at an alarming rate. AIDS was on everybody's minds, but not their lips. Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, did not mention the word AIDS publicly till 1987, after 40,000 people had already died. If one spoke about it, they were presumed to be at risk, which meant they were either Haitian, an IV drug user, or they were gay. Being a single male designer, I knew everyone would naturally just assume that I was Haitian. But maybe because I wasn't a member of one of the at-risk communities, it was easier for me to speak out when others wouldn't. So I created a public service campaign that you saw also in the film to address the pervasive stigma surrounding AIDS at the time. Arguably, more people have died from the stigma of AIDS than from AIDS itself. I make that case often. And the fact that nobody was talking about it. So the campaign was called For the Future of Our Children, shot by Annie Leibovitz, and features some of the most beautiful models in our industry and innocent children. Most people admire beautiful women, and we love most children. We don't learn to dislike them until we have to pay for their college education. I learned of an organization that was committed to AIDS research called AMFAR that I could and went on to support. In 1987, I was asked to join its board, the Foundation for AIDS Research, and 17 years later, I became its chairman. Since the 1980s, AMFAR has had a profound impact on the lives of millions of people living with HIV/AIDS around the world. That whole experience, it changed me. It has changed the company, it has changed the man, and it has changed the brand. I found that I was no longer just running a company with style, but rather a company with a conscience and a purpose. I had found a voice that has helped guide my journey ever since. For me, it became about not just what's on people's bodies, but also what's on their minds. Not just what they stand in, but also what they stand for. And if I couldn't change the world alone, I came to realize that I could at least be an accessory. As chairman of a public company, I began addressing and defending the question as to whether business and community should be independent. In fact, I came to realize that they are not just not independent, but in fact interdependent. That they are the proverbial hand that feed each other. I believe all businesses will realize this, and if their hearts don't get them there, eventually their balance sheets will. Hopefully the former. For us, it's been 35 years since we parked that 40-foot trailer on 6th Avenue, 35 years of addressing not just what people look like on the outside, but who they are on the inside. Ultimately, I believe that mine is a story of how a scrappy shoe company grew a social conscience and its business simultaneously. It's an example of how a company can use its valuable limited resources not just to create and sell products that it believes the community wants, but do it while providing for what the community needs. It's a story about how to use whatever platform you have to make the difference that you can. And finally, that a company can truly do well by doing good.